So as you can see from what Socrates has to say, pages 12, 13, 14, about the philosopher, it's a very heroic view of the philosopher. The philosopher, in his dedication to truth, has a contempt for his own body, a contempt for material things, and is always striving for the absolute, for truth, and is a very noble character insofar as he cares about the higher things rather than the coarse things of earthly life, you might say. And it's all very interesting, but it's all very dramatic and poetic and noble. But is it true? I mean, maybe that's an indelicate question because, one of the things you have to keep in mind in reading the Phaedo is that it's, he's about to die and they all know it. So one of the dynamics between Socrates and Simmias and Cebes, the main interlocutors, is that, they're a little hesitant to raise their doubts, to be openly skeptical about the things that Socrates is saying, considering the circumstances, right? After all, Socrates is trying to prove the immortality of the soul, and he's about to die. So it would seem that Socrates has a personal stake in how this argument goes. And he himself refers to that ironically, Socrates, right? We find those places. It's very funny. But, after this paean to the philosophers, it really is a fair question. Well, okay, but is it true? So if you look on page 15, around the middle of the page, right here, Socrates says, "This is my defense, Simmias and Cebes, to show you that I have reason for not being angry or grieved at leaving you and my masters here. I believe that in the next world, no less than in this, I shall meet with good masters and friends, though the multitude are incredulous of it. And if I have been more successful with you in my defense than I was with my Athenian judges, it is well." That kind of ends the first part of the dialogue right there. When Socrates had finished, Cebes replied to him and said, "I think that for the most part you are right, Socrates. But men are very incredulous of what you have said of the soul." I mean, maybe all this stuff about the nobility of the philosopher, maybe even the stuff about the forms and the nature of truth, maybe that's all right. But men are, he's trying to put it delicately. He doesn't say I am incredulous. He says, people are. But men are very incredulous of what you have said of the soul. They fear that she will no longer exist anywhere when she has left the body, but that she will be destroyed and perish on the very day of death. They think that the moment that she is released and leaves the body, she will be dissolved and vanish away like breath or smoke, and thenceforward cease to exist at all. If she were to exist somewhere as a whole, released from the evils which you have enumerated just now, we should have good reason to hope, Socrates, that what you say is true. But it will need no little persuasion and assurance to show that the soul exists after death and continues to possess any power or wisdom, which is a great question. It goes right to the heart of the whole issue here. Basically saying, Socrates, you painted this beautiful picture, but can the soul really exist independently of the body? If we grant the starting point of the argument about death, that it is a separation of soul and body, well, is it really plausible that the soul can exist apart from body? I think one of the things that we have to keep in mind, no matter what our beliefs are about death and what our beliefs are about the afterlife, is that there's no proof of it, in the sense that there's no evidence of it. And this becomes an issue later on in the dialogue when Socrates defends the whole practice of arguing. Because after all, there's no empirical evidence of life after death. That is, there's empirical evidence that global warming is real. I'll take something like that, right? Because we can We can take the temperature, we can look at sea levels, we can look at weather pattern changes, but especially temperature, right? There's empirical evidence, that global warming and climate change and global warming is real. Okay. Maybe we don't like to think about it, but it is. But the reason you can be sure of it is because you can take the temperature. You can say, well, average global temperatures have gone up tremendously in the past 40 years or so, or 50 years. And every year seems to break a record in terms of it being the hottest year on record, right? That's pretty good empirical evidence that the globe is warming, right? Well, you're not going to find any evidence like that for the existence of the soul after it separates from the body, right? It's just not like that kind of thing. It's a metaphysical question. It's a question about some matter that cannot be resolved by looking or measuring or observing. So we should admit that unless we believe in ghosts or talking to the dead, and, okay, if you want to believe in that, fine. But it's not true. I'm sorry. There's no talking. No one's ever talked to the dead. No one's ever actually seen a ghost, right? Those are, I'm sorry. You can believe whatever you want, but, I'm sorry. That's nonsense, right? I mean, there's no empirical evidence that the soul continues to exist after death. The only way that we would determine something like that is through argumentation and reasoning. Right? It's like the existence of God. There's no empirical evidence that God exists. If you want to argue for the existence of God, you certainly can. But it won't be empirical evidence. It'll be it'll be an argument that relies on pure reasoning. And same if you want to argue that God doesn't exist, right? It's not that sort of thing that can be determined by pointing at the evidence, because there is no evidence. It's a different sort of question. So, absent that evidence, though, Sieb's question is actually, is quite good. People are really incredulous of what you say. They really doubt what you say. I mean, can you actually establish that the soul, after its separation from the body, continues to exist? Because a lot of people think it's just that's it for the soul. Certainly, if you're an Epicurean, you would believe that once the body dies, the soul ceases to exist as well. There actually isn't a separation; that they both die at the same time. But granted that there's a separation, can you establish that the soul continues to exist? And that becomes really the main point of the dialogue, or the main focus, or the main goal of the dialogue, is to establish that there is some reason to believe that the soul continues to exist after death, and really that it exists independently of body. And so the dialogue at this point becomes much more focused on that question. And Socrates starts to go into some pretty specific arguments to that effect. If you look here, the first one is the notorious argument from opposites, which is a very interesting argument. I don't think it gets a lot of respect, and maybe it doesn't deserve a lot of respect, but it is quite an interesting argument to the effect that if everything comes from its opposite, then and if life and death, the living and the dead, are opposites, then the dead come from the living, which is true, but also the living come from the dead. It's a kind of a theory of reincarnation, which is quite interesting, but maybe not the most obviously true argument that anyone's ever given. The second argument, which begins on page, on page 19, is the argument from Recollection, which is again a reference to the theory of forms. There's a very famous dialogue called the Meno, where Socrates tries to prove that all knowledge is recollection of the form, and that this implicates that the soul must have existed before the birth of the body, because we didn't learn the forms while we were, in this life. So we must have learned them before we had bodies, when we were souls that didn't. It goes into the whole thing. And so if all knowledge is recollection, then the soul must pre-exist the body, because it must have learned about the form before it was born into a body. Very interesting and not implausible argument about recollection, or knowledge being recollection, but that would probably take us, way into other aspects of Plato's philosophy. But again, it mentions the forms. The forms are in the air here, right? The forms are in the background. So they agree that if we're born with knowledge of the forms, mentioned here on page 25, then Simmias, he said, is not this the truth? If, as we are forever repeating, beauty and good and the other ideas, and again, that's the forms, really exist, if they really exist, and if we refer all the objects of sensible perception to these ideas, which were formerly ours, and which we find to be ours still, and compare sensible objects with them, then just as they exist, our souls must have existed before ever we were born. But if they do not exist, then our reasoning will have been thrown away. That's a pretty incredible statement there, basically saying that if his theory of the forms is wrong, then his theory that the soul is immortal is probably wrong too. Is it so? If these ideas exist, does it not at once follow that our souls must have existed before we were born? And if they do not exist, then neither did our souls. And so, as you can see, this would suggest that the soul exists before the body. It doesn't quite prove that the soul exists after the death of the body, but at least it suggests that the soul, at least at one time, could exist without the body. But Simmias, or is it Sebes here, who's very sharp character, notice this discrepancy, or this, that the argument has indicated that the soul existed before birth, but it doesn't really indicate specifically that the soul will continue to exist after death. And so on page 26, Sebes says, but I do not think myself, Socrates, he continued, that you have proved that the soul will continue to exist when we are dead. The common fear which Sebes spoke of, that she may be scattered to the winds at death, and that death may be the end of her existence, still stands in the way. Assuming that the soul is generated and comes together from some other elements and exists before she ever enters the body, why should she not come to an end and be destroyed after she has entered into the body, when she is released from it? You are right, Simmias, said Sebes. I think that only half the required proof has been given, right? That the other half would be to prove that the soul continues to exist after death. It has been shown that our souls existed before we were born, right here. But it must also be shown that our souls will continue to exist after we are dead, no less than that they existed before we were born, if the proof is to be complete. So what does Socrates have to do? Well, we'll see. I'll make another video about this, because I think this is really, for me, the key argument. What Socrates says here on the next page, well, said Socrates, must we not ask ourselves this question? What kind of thing is liable to suffer dispersion? And for what kind of thing have we to fear dispersion? And then we must see whether the soul belongs to that kind or not, and be confident or afraid about our own soul's accordingly. That is, Socrates really begins to ask about the nature of the soul. And the question is the soul the kind of thing that can die? Or is it the kind of thing that can't? And that leads us, I think, into some very territory in terms of thinking about the question of immortality.